So we're standing here right in the middle of the office environment. Sorry about not being able to zoom in on the screens, but that is strictly prohibited. But we caught up with Jamie here, who the last time we saw you on GRTV, you were working on Far Cry 3, and I think this is an open world game, but a very different one. Is there any sort of experiences that you bring from working on a game that was so successful, especially in the open world aspect, as Far Cry 3 into this production?
Sure, I think that's the thing. I mean, people are probably a bit people might not see the immediate similarities between like a racing title and a first-person shooter, and they're not immediately apparent, that's for sure. But I think there's some kind of lessons in terms of structure that you really kind of like have drummed into you, I think, by a title like Far Cry 3. You really understand, okay, what's the kind of gameplay that you want to have, what's the experience you want players to be looking into, how do you want players to move through the world, how do you want to entice players to actually move through the world. And so it's those kind of lessons that you can really bring to bear for a game like, for Need for Speed Rivals, which will be a genuine open world experience.
So is it things like sort of the amount of time, the sort of the loops that you bring into it, and sort of the variation that you have in the open world, or what is it?
I think, yeah, I mean, definitely it's how you're asking players to play the game, where you're asking them to spend their time, the kind of the more formal and the more informal structures, how those two things combine to kind of pull players around the world. I think that this idea of kind of distraction-based gameplay, this idea of, treating the player as if he's got kind of ADHD almost, saying, hey, go and do this thing, and then just trying to pull as much as possible, pull them off the path while they're doing that thing. And making sure there's a richness of experience as they're moving around the world, making sure that there's enough for them to do so that they might start heading off to try and do one thing, but on their way, they're seeing all these other things and they can't help but get involved and get dragged off to go and do other things as they're moving around the world.
And also that freedom of sort of creating your own experience, not having to follow a set path for all. If you enjoy a certain style of gaming, you could just go around and do that and sort of have your own progression in that sense.
Very much so, and I mean, I think open world titles in general, and I mean specifically the title that we're trying to make here, it's about empowering players. It's about saying, look, you guys understand the experience that you want to have, and you decide how the gameplay flows. I think that's really particularly important when we're talking about kind of probably our main feature, which is a feature called All Drive, which is kind of really trying to break down these barriers between single player and multiplayer. If you want to play the single player experience, then it's going to be a great experience. We really make sure that there's a richness and depth to that experience in and of itself, so you're never going to kind of go, oh, well, I wish I could have, or I'm missing out by. But then if we layer multiplayer on top of that, then that's where the game really shines. That's really, where the game experience really expands and grows out. The idea of All Drive is that you move from a single player experience to a multiplayer experience without any kind of going through any lobby screens or anything like that, without having to kind of pull back out to a menu and then jump back in. It's literally like if you're driving around in the world and you do something and I see that you've done it, I'll be like, oh, I want to go and do that with you, and I can jump in, I can do that. And then there's also an asynchronous play there as well, so that you might have done it in your world. Say you've just got a record for a jump or something like that. I see you've done it. I can go and do that in my world, or I can come in and I can join you and I can try and jump that with you, or I can join as a cop and I can try and mess with your stuff. I mean, it's really that idea of empowering players to kind of get involved with the gameplay the way they want to.
So I guess that also makes it sort of an ownership issue. Do you own your own game, or how much can you mess? There has to be some sort of limits to how much you can mess with someone else's game, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's where that's the structures and the patterns we're trying to set up in the world. It's this idea of races and chases, but in an open world setting. So sure, there are some ground rules in the world. There's some stuff that you can and can't do, but then also we understand that you're going to have a bunch of adversaries out there. You're going to have a bunch of other rivals. There's a whole other faction that are trying to shut down the gameplay that you're trying to do. So that's where we kind of encourage this kind of chaos, and that's where we want this kind of like this organized mayhem. That it feels like you'll be sitting at a race start and you'll be waiting to go, and then a cop arrives and suddenly like, right, just go, we got to run, we got to race. And that's the feeling that we want, is that you're never quite sure what's around the corner. You're never quite sure how your game experience is going to be changed.
So if we talk about the setting, the world, what kind of place is it? What kind of racing is there available in this place?
The world itself, we're calling it Redview County, and it's kind of this analog of like Western America. We're looking for kind of like you to get a feel of these different parts in the States. I don't know if you've been driving around like around California or Portland or places like this. We're really trying to capture the feel of these places, the essence of these roads, rather than it being like a one-for-one, oh, we took this highway and we mapped it out specifically. We want the game roads to feel fun first and foremost, that it's a driving experience first and foremost, but also there's something about those roads that you really recognize and feel as kind of like, yeah, no, that feels like the right kind of place. On top of that, we're also then layering, and I think this is something that Dave Taylor, our art director, and the art team are really bringing something new to a racing title. We want this kind of grittiness, we want this kind of feel of the world. It's raw, it's got teeth, it's got, it's really going to surprise you, I think, with some of the kind of it's pretty nasty sometimes. And we'll have things like, changing weather, we'll have things where, you'll be driving along and then suddenly you're going to feel a storm coming in. You're going to see the cable wires are going to start, whistling in the wind and getting blown around. You're going to see leaves are going to get kicked up. You're going to see the rain hitting the road, hitting the car, and all that kind of stuff. It's going to feel, I think, more of a kind of a grounded, mature experience than perhaps you've had to date in the Need for Speed title.
And I guess that's also plays into all the simulation that's there in the background, so you can sort of do that without sort of compromising what was sort of the Need for Speed gameplay.
No, definitely, and I mean we have a real pedigree when it comes to but it comes to the Need for Speed title overall, which is a very, very filmic franchise. There's a lot of stuff there about high production values. There's a lot of stuff there about making sure that people feel it's got a real sort of just a quality of experience. Also then, we're very lucky in that we've got guys from Criterion who spent a very long time, making these kind of games. There's a lot of experience that we can draw on there. And then I think there's the stuff that we bring as Ghost, which is, we are a little bit, unknown. We're coming slightly out of left field. We've got some interesting people who necessarily, we bring a breadth of experience, we bring a diversity of experience to the table as well. And I think that then, those elements combine to give something that I think feels quite fresh.
So, speaking of this sort of living, breathing world, obviously a very sort of thing that you are talking about as a next-gen feature. What will it be toned down in releases on current-gen consoles, or how will you sort of accentuate that?
We want to make sure that we have, certainly gameplay experience-wise, that we have something that's really, across the board, it's the same experience as much as possible. We're going to really, really push the boundaries no matter what platform we're coming out on. But I think the core essence of the gameplay, for no other reason than actually we want to make sure that we're not killing ourselves in production, the core of the game needs to be the same and will be the same no matter what platform that we're coming out on. It's just that we'll expand it where we possibly can. So whatever platform we're coming on, we really want to push it visually. I think that's something about working with Frostbite, is that having an engine like that, it really lets us do some pretty incredible things in terms of visuals, in terms of the sense of openness and space. Frostbite's a great engine for doing outdoor scenes and for doing kind of these huge, great big long vistas. And I think that's something that you really feel when you're driving around in the game, is that every now and again, you'll be racing along and then suddenly you'll just be like, wow, that's amazing. And then you're kind of back into the gameplay again. And that's what we want. We want players to really feel that, that there is a beauty in the world that we're creating too.
But it does sound like you're sort of pushing the envelope in terms of size for a Frostbite engine game. Is this sort of the biggest open world game that's been done on this engine?
Size-wise, honestly, I really wouldn't know. To be honest, all I know is that the game world that we're making is massive. We could probably make ourselves a lot easier for ourselves by not making such a massive world. But it's important that we're ambitious. We want to push the boundaries. We want, as Ghost, we're setting ourselves up as a new studio. We want people to be surprised by what we come out with first go.
So obviously size matters in terms of the game world, but there's also like a sort of I kind of like the sort of the densely populated open world, especially in racing games, because you don't want to have to drive distances for different things to happen. You have to have that density, and I think Far Cry 3 did a great job on the sort of the density of the open world. What's the strategy there, to populate this world?
It's a really good question, actually. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to judge, and that's something where, having had people that have been through the mill before on those kind of things, you really feel a sweet spot where it's like, okay, you push it and you try to fill the world up, and then it's like, okay, no, it's too much, and then you had to kind of like pull it back a bit and then add bits more in and stuff like that, as well as the kind of the density of the experience. There's also the variety of the experience as well. You need to make sure that there's enough going into the game that makes you feel like it's operating on a variety of different levels, be it kind of the more second-to-second gameplay, push right out to the kind of more hour-to-hour gameplay, and everything in between, so that you're finding these kind of like, major sort of spots all the way through. And then sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're not looking to these big set-piece events. Sometimes you're doing, I'm just going to go and keep doing this jump over and over again until I get 300 meters on a jump, whatever it might be. But it's this idea about enabling players, empowering players to find the gameplay that they want to find.
I think there's a little bit of a contradiction there in sort of making it organic and sort of just adapting to the player, but also making it sort of clear that you know exactly like, okay, I'm going to do this kind of thing because then I'll get this kind of experience. You have to be clear about that as well, so that the player is making an informed choice.
It's really the trick with open worlds that's very, very difficult, and that finding that sweet spot between players heading off and feeling like, yeah, I can go and do what I want, but also it being a managed experience still. And that's something that's a difficult balance to strike, and that's something that we push with Far Cry, and we're definitely pushing with this as well, is that you don't feel how managed an experience the game is behind the hood, that you still have that feeling of expansiveness, you still have that feeling of like, I'm just driving down a coastal road, or I'm just driving through the desert and it's fine and I've got the window down, but I'm going to go and do this now. But that kind of choice of experience is that something that, even though it's been managed very, very much for you under the hood, you don't feel that as a player.
Obviously, the world is one part, but there's also got to be cars populating that world. You sort of get an idea what a Need for Speed game, what kind of cars you're going to see, and the West Coast setting perhaps also lends itself sort of to what kind of cars you can. Is it what we expect? What kind of things can we expect from that side of it?
Well, we're not going too much into the cars right now. The one that I can talk about without getting yanked by PR if I'm not careful is Ferrari. We're super excited to have Ferrari back in the game again. I mean, obviously it's something that's been missing from the last few Need for Speed titles. I think we're feeling like now it's, you know, the proper Need for Speed experience again now that Ferrari's back on the table. The Berlinetta, which is a beautiful car, is back in the game. That's something to keep an eye out for at E3.